There are no guides that I've been able to find to scrambling in the Lofoten Islands in Northern Norway, north of the Arctic Circle. So in order to find scrambles, it's just a question of looking at maps and having a guess, or looking around the landscape, seeing what you can find. And that's what I did yesterday, and saw a nice looking ghyll to scramble up. I'm at Bjørnskinnfjellet in the south of Andøya Island. Andøya is not actually technically part of the Lofotens, it's some way north of that. And it looked like a reasonable grade 1 scramble, but I've never scrambled in this part of the world before, and I only got a rather distant look at it, so don't know what I'm going to find. Here's the car park that's the starting point, just to the west of the village of Bjørnskinn. Got parking for maybe about a dozen cars. You'll see that although I'm pronouncing it Bjørnskinn, which I'm reliably informed is the right way to do it, it actually looks like it's written Bjørnskinn. Sounds like it should be the name of a Norwegian heavy metal band. About a quarter mile from the car park up this forest track, you'll come to a sign pointing off on the right. That is the path all the way to the top, very steep path, to Bjørnskinnfjellet, marked on all trails, and just to the left of that is where the beck crosses under the road. Get in anytime from here. The shape of the beck is kind of like this, so it's shallow in terms of water depth and in terms of gradient, as you can see here in the initial parts. Doesn't really make sense to get in because there's a path that runs pretty much alongside. At around about the point that the spruce trees around the path give way to birch trees, you'll find these two rocks, and the gradient on the beck is getting a little bit steeper, seeing the odd cascade. I didn't bring my wetsuit with me, so I am going to get in at this point to see just how cold it is as an initial foray, because although it's mid-June, the temperatures are only around about 10 degrees centigrade. At this stage there is a steady set of small cascades. The surface is quite good, not too slippery. Water temperature is not freezing, but it is quite fresh, meaning that I'll probably need to be getting out every few minutes to warm my feet up, and definitely wish I had brought my neoprene socks. To give a bit more detail on what's underfoot, there are some small flat areas of what looks like sand and pebbles, and then quite a few mossy rocks. The moss is relatively grippy. The odd slightly unexpected dip, but nothing that's taken me up to more than knee height in the water. You'll see a number of trees and branches across the beck, and this is also the point where one becomes fairly committed to going into it, because the path on the right hand side is gradually diverging more and more from the beck. Excellent set of grade 1 cascades in this last section. There are plenty of rocks in them to step up, but you do have to think about what you're doing, and as the gradient inches ever steeper, we're getting closer to things that you might call waterfalls. Higher up means better views, though I was wrong about the path. It's stuck quite close to the beck to this point, and I think it's from here that it does start to diverge. And higher up also means a bit steeper, and that means better scrambling. For instance, this nice 30-foot set of cascades. The trees are starting to thin out, and possibly so is the beck. Trees have been a nuisance in places where they're an obstacle that you have to get over, under or around, but they've also been pretty useful handholds when getting up a number of the cascades. That thinning out of the beck has happened to such an extent that in places it's a bit difficult to get through. Then in terms of the rocks, there's a little bit less moss and a little bit more slippery algae on the surface. And finally, the gradient here is that rather betwixt and between. It's just not quite steep enough to make the cascades interesting or challenging to scramble up. So in parts here, I'm just walking alongside the beck. Noting these fern fronds and other young formative vegetation, that would mean when we get beyond this stage of the year into summer, this section of the beck is going to be even more overgrown and even more difficult to get through, meaning it's even more sensible to get out and walk alongside. There's no obvious marker of the point I'm currently at, but there's the beginnings of a small uptick to the gradient, sufficient that, notwithstanding the trees across, I've decided it's worth getting back in and scrambling. Here's some further example of the grade 1 fare at this level of the beck. You don't totally need 3 points of contact, but nonetheless it is fun to go up. Manoeuvring around the branches and twigs was a nuisance in a couple of places, but on the plus side, the slippery rock surfaces have faded away, leaving good grip all the way up at this point. The other good news is that you're now pretty much above the tree line, but the bad news that more than negatively compensates is that the gradient is slackening off somewhat. Despite the somewhat slackened gradient and some bushes, even if not trees, occasionally covering the beck, it was definitely worthwhile carrying on scrambling beyond the previous point. But now the beck has reached such a state that it's time to call a halt, at least to the scramble, but I'll be carrying on hiking to the top of Bjørnskinnfjellet. This is the panorama that awaits you at the top, weather permitting, and as you'll see, some rain getting in the way of the view today. It takes about 20 minutes as the crow flies from the end of the scramble to the top. More like 30 if you think you know the way and veer wildly off course. When I saw it from afar yesterday, I thought that the Bjørnskinnfjellet beck was going to be a bit more challenging than it turned out to be. I could have done with it being a maybe quarter or a half a grade more difficult. But I'm in the business of grade 1 scrambles, and it was a pretty good grade 1 scramble. 700 feet overall, and you don't get that in the Peak District, for example. Probably divide it into 4 different sections. First bit was the pleasant walk in a conifer forest just beside the beck. Then really good section of grade 1 cascade scrambling. Third section, bit of a pain in the arse, bit too overgrown, bit too slippery, went on a bit too long. And then the final bit, really good grade 1 scramble again. Overall, going to rate it a 7 out of 10. If I was in the area, I would definitely come back and do it again. It's quite protected, so you could do it in a variety of different weathers and probably at different times of the year. And when you get to the top, further 1,000 feet up from the end of the scramble, up to the top of Bjørnskinnfjellet, if you're lucky, you get a really fantastic panoramic view.